Thank you for joining us. We are Geosyntec. We're here to talk about project development from idea to strategy to realization, carbon intensity, and key project development considerations. So thank you for joining us. I'm Lori Carter, and this is Eric Amundsen. So our discussion will go through greenfield project development risk considerations, then we'll go into some detailed discussion on carbon intensity estimation, and then we'll finish it out with some conclusion. Okay, so some of the big drivers for hydrogen project development. There's a high interest in using hydrogen as low carbon fuel and feedstock. We have many clients at Geosyntec that have commitments to meet net zero targets. The innovations in electrolyzer technologies are driving the hydrogen project costs down to more realistic goals. We at Geosyntec support in the feasibility stage, project development. So we're seeing a lot of potential cost savings in using hydrogen. Some of the key considerations, we've got available resources, and then we're looking at tax credits and regulatory applicability. We're looking at incentives and the requirements to obtain the incentives, and then what are our off-takers criteria. And then you can see here in this map what we focus on a lot in supporting our clients in project development is location. So where are you going to have an optimal site that can provide you the feedstock and resources that you need to develop your hydrogen project? Another key consideration in project development is the stakeholder risk and managing that throughout the life cycle of the project. Key stakeholders include communities, regulators, developers, investors, and the customers. Each project that we develop or support our clients in developing, we have to ask the questions. What does the location look like? Is it rural or developed? Do we have adequate feedstock supply? What does the modeling look like? Is there available infrastructure, or will we need to develop new infrastructure to deliver feedstock or supply product? What are our distribution considerations? Who are our off-takers? Where are we located adjacent to port, rail, truck? What's the political climate? What are the environmental and social considerations that we need to make for this project location? And then what's the demand? So all of these factors are critical in considering where we're developing the project and in the ultimate success of the project. Just kind of an overview of some of the siting risk considerations. There are pros and cons to where you're developing your hydrogen project as it's related to feedstock location. So some of the pros of the off-site would be if you're developing nearer to your renewable energy source, you may see some benefit in having an established supply. You may have an opportunity for greater capacity and throughputs because you're locating nearer to an available existing supply. However, if you wanted to develop your project with your on-site energy resource, okay. Anyways, so on-site, off-site, pros and cons. Something to consider on each aspect of that. And then your key feedstocks for hydrogen projects, you've got water, you've got carbon dioxide, methane, and then your renewable energy supply itself. Water, as we mentioned, and as most of you know, is critical for especially green hydrogen project development. So something that we support our clients in very early on is looking at the availability and sustainability of the supply. There are numerous publicly available tools that we typically start out with, and then we drill down and look at the specifics for each location. Not just the immediate supply, if it's surface water, groundwater, the quality of the water itself, but then also long-term, what does that look like for supporting production? Now that we've talked about water, Eric's going to talk about carbon intensity.
Thank you, Lori. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So when someone asks you for the carbon intensity of your hydrogen, what exactly are they requesting? There's a lot that goes into this estimation. And so today, I'm going to cover what some of those decisions are regarding conceptual estimation approaches. And when you are working with a biogenic feedstock or energy source, and in particular a waste biogenic feedstock or energy source, these decisions can have a significant effect on the final carbon intensity results. And examples, of course, of biogenic sources include crops generated or grown specifically for fuel production. It can be food waste, crop waste, landfill gas, logging residues, and many others. As a quick one-slide review of life cycle assessment, a life cycle assessment evaluates potential environmental impacts across the life cycle of a product or a system. And this is typically broken up into several stages. So there's the raw materials acquisition stage, which can be growing crops, extracting fossil fuels from the earth, mining for metals, diverting water or sourcing water in some way. And then there's the stages of material processing, product manufacturing, use, which in the case of fuel, of course, is combustion of the fuel, and then end of life, which can include landfilling, incineration, recycling, or refurbishment. And terminology-wise, people often refer to cradle to grave and cradle to gate. Cradle to grave is starting at the very early materials acquisition, first stage, all the way through the final disposition of the product, the end of life. And cradle to gate is the first three stages, right up through the exit gate of the production facility when the fuel or product is ready to ship, and excludes the last two life cycle stages. This is often where hydrogen carbon intensity is reported up through the gate after it's been manufactured. So three important factors or conceptual estimation approaches where a choice has to be made in terms of how it's dealt with in the carbon intensity calculation. Three of them are listed here. So first, whether and how you're going to get a credit for avoided emissions. Second, are biogenic greenhouse gas emissions being treated differently from fossil greenhouse gas emissions? And third, whether you're going to account for co-products, which typically people do, but how are you going to account for co-products in terms of carbon intensity? So as one example of the types of different results you can get, this graph shows the carbon intensity of producing bio-compressed natural gas from dairy cow manure, using anaerobic digestion to generate biogas, upgrade it to RNG, compress it to CNG, and then combust the CNG. And the color blocks represent the different life stages or credits, and then they are netted out against each other, and you get the black diamonds as a result. And you'll see on the left, we've got a carbon intensity of negative 268. The middle graph shows plus 66, and the right-hand graph shows plus 124. Now, these are all for the exact same inputs, the same process, and the same amount of bio-CNG produced and combusted. So this is the same process. The difference here is just how we've taken an approach to those different conceptual approaches. So the answer on the left comes from including a credit for avoided methane emissions, but not including a biogenic carbon credit. The middle one does not include avoided methane emissions, but does include the biogenic carbon credit. And then the one on the right includes neither, which you end up at the 124 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of bio-CNG. Now, just as an aside, that plus 124 is actually higher than fossil compressed natural gas when you exclude those credits. So regarding the avoided emissions, this slide shows how avoided emissions can be incorporated into a carbon intensity estimate. And this is within a system where animal waste is being used to produce a renewable fuel. So the animal waste has two possible paths, is the assumption that starts with avoided emissions accounting. So the animal waste could go the upper path, which shows the business as usual path, where it might be put in an anaerobic lagoon or any other waste management approach or combination of approaches. And this number, and there'll be methane emissions and some carbon dioxide emissions, and this number can be based on the past, what's typically done in the past, how it's being dealt with today in the present, or how it is assumed to be in the future, what the waste management business as usual path would be. The bottom path is the path that the waste actually takes when it goes through your process of whatever the process is to get to a renewable fuel and the fuel combustion. And what happens is you take those avoided emissions and net them out against your bottom path. So you measure or estimate your actual emissions for taking the bottom path and generating your fuel, and then you look at what would have happened if you didn't take the animal waste. That's the assumption that's being made here to make an avoided emissions calculation. And if that top path typically has high emissions, then when you credit it against your lower path at the bottom, you might go negative. And that's where that minus 268 came from in the earlier slide. Oh, I'll go back actually. So biogenic carbon emissions was the other one I mentioned. There, if you look at the bottom path, you have CO2 and CH4 emissions coming off your process of turning the waste into RNG, and then also when you actually combust it. Now, of course, those carbon atoms in the CH4 and CO2 could be from a biogenic source, or they could be from a fossil source. The atmosphere doesn't care in that instant that it's released where they came from. Those compounds have the exact same effect. What can be different is how you account for what boundary you draw around the overall process you're assessing, and whether you're looking at when that carbon was removed from the atmosphere by plants or crops and taken out of the atmosphere. And that's obviously a negative. That's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then, say at the fuel combustion step, when you combust it, you can net them out if you give a biogenic credit. You say, well, we are burning stuff that in fairly recent time was pulled out of the atmosphere, so those come very close to netting out to each other. And then in terms of co-product credit, the third conceptual approach, I've added to the bottom portion of the path here and shown that this waste to energy path includes anaerobic digestion to biogas and RNG. But coming off of anaerobic digestion can be an anaerobic digestion residue. And that can be managed in such a way that you can extract nutrients and create a fertilizer. So that fertilizer is now a second product, a co-product with your hydrogen or CNG in this case. And when you have an extra product, you can allocate or assign some of your emissions to that other product. You're not just producing one thing, you're producing two. But how do you split up that answer? How do you split up those carbon emissions? And there's a number of ways to do it. There's no one size fits all. It can be different for different circumstances or goals. But one way is displacement. And that's where you say, okay, we're making fertilizer here. That means that another facility that typically is, say, primarily produces fertilizer, that facility won't have to produce as much fertilizer. So they're going to have fewer emissions over at that other facility, and the fuel producer here is going to take a credit for that and show a reduction in their emissions associated with their fuel production, their bio-CNG in this case. So that's the third one, the co-product credits. So in sum, you really want to understand when you're providing a carbon intensity or asking for a carbon intensity or reviewing carbon intensities, what went into the calculations? Are avoided emissions included? That can make a very large difference. Are emissions of biogenic carbon treated differently than fossil emissions? And finally, are co-product credits included at all? And then go back to you.
So I think the key takeaway here is not only is it important to select a site that's going to be optimal for your hydrogen project development, but it's also how you approach developing your basis for that project. So as Eric explained, having that strategy, understanding the nuances of the carbon intensity calculations, and then what that can yield for the project, if it's in the form of incentives or other benefits, that's really critical for us. So, yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.